Theodore Teddy Roosevelt entered the office in September of 1901. A man keen to adventure and hunting looked to rule the executive office in a similar way. His motto, big stick diplomacy. Up to this point, the U.S. had been involved in foreign affairs to an extent, but Roosevelt initiated the genesis of what many call neocolonialism. Its goal was not only economic but ideological, to spread American philosophies and socio-political norms in quote-unquote less civilized areas. And what's more American than baseball? Baseball became a source of identity for Latin American and Bahamian nations, but often shrouded the true intentions of American diplomacy.
Y yo, Alexandra.
Welcome to Cuba. So the original people that came here were the Taínos until Columbus arrived in Hispaniola and killed them all with disease. And fast forward to 1850 is when we get the 10 Years' War. They're fighting for their freedom. We finally have freedom in Spain. All right, so we can build up our economy, right? No. You see, Cuba got sugar, and we gonna need that. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, the U.S. owned 40% of sugar in Cuba alone. Fast forward to 1940, the U.S. are isolationists at this point. However, communists tried to support Batista. The communists originally tried to support Batista, but the Americans essentially outbid them. America, a country that advocates for freedom and democratic elections, supports Batista in a coup to overthrow the government. So like I said, America was implementing baseball in Latin America and Japan post-isolationist and World War II, World War I era in order to spread American ideals and whatnot. But the man that goes by the name of Gio Lonati, I hope I pronounced that right, he's a scholar on sports and colonialism, and he divides colonialism using sport in three different parts. The first part is sport, colonization, and civilization. America is anti-colonial in its genesis exclusively. So these colonies, or these slave islands, as I like to call them, such as Jamaica, Cuba, and the DR and Haiti, they look up to U.S. as an anti-colonial origin. So the U.S. was against England and ended up becoming what it was. Abuse becomes the abuser, essentially. In this first stage that Gio Lonati describes, these colonial eras actually take in the sports that are brought to them via colonialism from the U.S. in sympathy to what the U.S. should or used to stand for. Round two, or stage two, of the three stages of sports as they pertain to colonialism, the colonies, he calls it sport, nationalism, post-colonialism, and development. So once these colonies find their way in the New World and start to build up governments, and they kind of cement the sport that was brought to them as the national pastime or the new national sport, they begin to make it their own, kind of. As I'll talk about in the future, Japan, their culture was very tied into the way of the samurai. So this meant rigid training, discipline, slow to surrender. And we'll see how that connects culturally with the Western ideals of baseball. So they take in, Japan is historically a very isolationist state, but as baseball comes in, they start to implement their culture with Western theology, trying not to be lost to the Western world. And the final stage, these colonies start to even reject the U.S. So they find out that the U.S. either doesn't match with them ideologically, or they become so nationalistic to a point where they want the sport to be their own culturally. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrives to isolationist Japan. This, of course, was the origin of baseball in Japan. However, the Meiji Restoration aimed to unite Japan against outside powers. The most who would refer as the father of baseball in Japan, however, was Horace Wilson. He was an American official sent over to Japan to teach history at Japanese universities. Japan at this point was still practicing feudal societal practices. The American government wanted to, quote-unquote, civilize a feudal society. As I stated earlier, Japan wanted to introduce new Western ideologies, institutions, and technologies while still imbuing them with the Japanese spirit. This is still seen today as Japanese baseball players see training as a spiritual practice. They also still practice the way of the samurai in certain aspects. In rigid training, rigid practice, even at the high school level, coaches are being paid $200,000. During the war, we saw the rejection of baseball as a whole, as warlords banned baseball throughout the country. Following World War II, General MacArthur arrived in Japan to keep communism at bay. I hate to be overly critical of the United States and its imperialist neo-colonial era. However, it did bridge gaps where needed. Ryuji Suzuki once said, "America is occupying Japan. We have to use diplomacy, not guns. Baseball will build a bridge." Suzuki was a vital piece in pioneering the Japanese Baseball League as well as solidifying U.S. and Japanese relations post-World War II, especially in the midst of the Cold War. Japan has been in its stage 3 since the end of the Cold War and has distinguished itself from American baseball on all facets. They still signify and live out the way of the samurai and are expected to train weekly, daily, and even sometimes hourly. Many could argue that they are much better than the U.S. today. Admittedly, we have taken a hiatus from Latin America as well as the Bahamas. The reason I started with Cuba is because it was one of the first ever places that the U.S. took baseball. Following slave revolts and the Cuban Revolution, Cuban sugar plantation owners moved to the Dominican Republic, and with them, they brought baseball. These elites from Cuba started up sugar refineries, and with them, they got workers, Dominican workers. These workers were incentivized by baseball play. So essentially, other sugar refineries would play other sugar refineries in exhibition baseball games. This, of course, is the Dominican Republic's first stage. The whole story of the origin and genesis of baseball in the Dominican Republic backs my theory on why in colonialism, the abused always becomes the abuser. It seems to be a cyclical phenomenon in which sports are taken to these colonial areas, and these sports are in turn used by the colonies on other colonies as a colonial tactic. In 1916, the U.S. invaded the DR following failed dictatorships and financial crises. This would catapult and act as the catalyst for stages 2 and 3 of sports and colonialism in the Dominican Republic. With this, there was a growing disgust or dislike of the American government. While the relationship between the DR and the U.S. in the 20th century was mostly political, today the MLB relies on the DR more heavily than any other country on the planet. Santo Domingo alone has over 80 men who have played in the MLB. Robinson Cano, an MLB legend, is from Santo Domingo, and his father runs one of the most esteemed baseball academies. The Dominican Republic differs from Japan and Cuba as it pertains to the
Me gustaría tener la fama, llegar a la Grande Liga.
For many of the kids in the Dominican Republic, baseball is all they have, and it's an outlet to get out of the DR as well as
And just like in any business.
I mean, look at what this YouTuber commented under a video about the Dominican Republic in baseball. I grew up in the Dominican Republic, and something particular about the country is that baseball is so far integrated into the culture that you just grow into it. Playing baseball as a kid was just like eating and breathing to me. Just so I can attempt to encapsulate how good Dominicans are at baseball, it's time to compare those statistics. I would like to start by pointing out that I am not a math major. I haven't taken a math class since senior year of high school. So I am assuming that my math is correct, just based off that most of this is just statistics, and all I had to do was divide, and I think I multiplied one time for some reason. Anyway, so there's around 340 million people that live in the USA. Around 11 million that live in the Dominican Republic. Of the Dominican Republic's total population is 3% compared to the USA. Ladies and gentlemen, the DR's 171 players is the equivalent to 5,130 players when equating the DR's 11 million population to the US's 340 million population. In the end, baseball has not only been a cultural icon, but an imperialistic tool for the US to implement diplomatic policies abroad. It has given differing cultures an aim and a passion. It has exposed grifters and diplomats alike, while at the same time bridged narrow gaps in post-war climates. But the game itself has always been just that, a game.
Motivation, C comes round and C goes down on me, and I'll make you smile like a drug for you. Do ever what you wanna do, coming over you. Keep on smiling what we go through.